Clara Bishop kept her eyes fixed on the tile floor of the university's science building the first time Ryder Callahan sat down across from her in Professor Hale's environmental biology lab, and when he stuck out his hand to introduce himself as her new project partner, she stared at it for 2 full seconds before forcing herself to shake it as briefly as physically possible, already counting the minutes until she could reasonably leave the room without seeming rude or drawing any more attention to herself than the assigned seating chart already had. Ryder pulled his hand back with the particular irritation of a man who is used to people wanting to be near him rather than actively avoiding his gaze, and muttered something under his breath about this being exactly the semester he needed a partner who couldn't stand to look at him, a comment he would spend considerable time regretting once he actually got to know the woman he'd just written off in under 30 seconds. Before we get further into how these two ended up stuck together for an entire semester, if stories like this hook you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because this pairing gets considerably more complicated before it gets anywhere close to good. Professor Hale, oblivious to the tension radiating off both students, clapped her hands together and announced that partner assignments for the semester-long coral restoration research project were final, no exceptions, no swaps, effective immediately, a policy she repeated twice more for emphasis, as several students in the back row groaned audibly at whoever they'd been paired with. Clara had spent the past 3 years perfecting the art of making herself invisible around men, ever since the spring of her senior year of high school when a boy she'd trusted completely had shown her exactly how little that trust was worth, an experience she had never fully explained to anyone outside a single, painful conversation with a campus counselor during her first semester, and one she had absolutely no intention of revisiting for the benefit of a swimmer who couldn't even be bothered to remember her name correctly on the first 2 attempts. In the years since, she had built a careful set of rules for herself without ever consciously deciding to, always sitting near the door in every classroom, always walking on the side of the sidewalk closer to open businesses rather than empty lots, always keeping her phone in her hand rather than her bag whenever she walked anywhere alone after dark. Small, exhausting habits that had become so automatic she barely registered them as fear anymore, simply as the price of moving safely through a world she'd learned the hard way not to trust blindly. She had chosen this university specifically because it was 3 states from home, because the marine biology program was strong enough to justify the distance, and because she had told herself, packing her dorm room boxes with a kind of grim determination, that a fresh start somewhere nobody knew her story meant she could simply exist quietly for 4 years without anyone asking questions she didn't want to answer. College, she had promised herself, would be quiet. She had not accounted for a required lab partner who apparently could not go 5 whole minutes without saying something. Ryder Callahan had exactly one priority walking into his junior year, and it had nothing to do with coral reefs or environmental biology credits he only needed because his academic advisor had informed him, with visible enjoyment, that his science requirement could not be satisfied by another semester of weight training theory. Ryder swam the 200-meter freestyle in a time that had already caught the attention of 2 Olympic development coaches, and he had spent every waking hour outside the pool for the past 2 years building a body, a schedule, and a life engineered entirely around minimizing distractions, a category that included, by his own strict personal policy, girlfriends, close friendships, and anyone who required emotional energy he considered better spent on split times and stroke efficiency, a policy he had followed with near-religious discipline right up until the semester a required science credit put a quiet, guarded stranger directly across the lab bench from him twice a week. His coach had warned him at the start of the year that this was the season that mattered most, the season Olympic trials committees would be watching most closely, and Ryder had built an entire mental framework around the idea that discipline meant eliminating every variable that wasn't directly related to getting faster in the water. "You're going to have to actually talk to me eventually," Ryder said, dropping into the seat beside Clara during their first official lab session, watching her arrange her notes with the kind of meticulous precision that suggested she'd rather organize index cards than make eye contact with him. "This project is 40% of our grade. I need this grade." He said it with more edge than he probably intended, still irritated at being paired with someone who'd barely looked at him twice, though something in the way she kept her hands perfectly still while she worked made him soften his tone slightly before he finished the thought. Clara kept her eyes on her notes and told him, in the flattest tone she could manage, that she was fully aware of the grading breakdown and had every intention of doing her share of the work without either of them needing to have a personality around each other in the process. Ryder, who was not used to being dismissed quite so efficiently by anyone, found himself oddly fascinated rather than offended, an unfamiliar reaction he chose to attribute to simple curiosity about someone who clearly didn't care in the slightest that he was, according to most of the campus, something of a big deal. Over the following weeks, their research sessions in the marine biology wet lab settled into an uneasy rhythm, Clara handling the data analysis with a focus that bordered on obsessive, Ryder handling the physical fieldwork component that required considerably more hours in the campus pool facility's connected saltwater tanks than either of them had anticipated when they signed up for the project. Their first few sessions passed in near total silence, Clara answering direct questions in clipped, efficient sentences and volunteering nothing beyond what the project strictly required, while Ryder, unused to being ignored by anyone, alternated between irritation and a reluctant, growing curiosity about a girl who seemed genuinely uninterested in whatever social currency his swim team reputation carried around the rest of campus. He found himself, somewhere around the second week, deliberately arriving a few minutes early to their sessions, telling himself it was about getting ahead on the fieldwork logs, though he couldn't quite explain why he'd started noticing the particular way Clara chewed on the end of her pen when she was concentrating, or the fact that she hummed under her breath without seeming to realize it whenever the lab was empty except for the two of them. Clara noticed, despite her best efforts not to notice anything about him at all, that Ryder was considerably more careful around her than his reputation suggested he'd be around anyone, always announcing himself before entering a room, always leaving noticeable space between them at the lab bench, always asking before touching shared equipment rather than simply reaching past her the way most of her other male classmates did, without thinking twice. She told herself this meant nothing, that he was probably just trying to avoid a harassment complaint from a girl who flinched every time someone moved too quickly near her, but some small, cautious part of her had started, against every instinct honed over 3 years of careful self-protection, to notice the specific gentleness of it. She caught herself, more than once, watching him work through the saltwater tank samples with a patience that seemed entirely at odds with everything she'd heard about him around campus, the intense, unfriendly athlete who supposedly didn't have time for anyone who couldn't help his training schedule, and found the contradiction considerably harder to dismiss than she wanted it to be. "You don't have to do that," Clara said one evening, for weeks into the project, watching Ryder deliberately walk the long way around the lab table instead of cutting directly behind her chair the way the shorter path would have allowed. "Do what?" Ryder asked, though something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "The extra space. The announcing yourself before you come in. I've noticed." Ryder was quiet for a moment, setting down the water sample he'd been carrying with unusual care. "You flinch," he said finally. "The first week, when I reached past you for the pH meter, you flinched so hard you knocked over a beaker. I figured whatever that was about, it wasn't my business to ask, but it seemed like the decent thing to do to just not add to it." Clara felt something in her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear for the first time in longer than she could remember, and found herself, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, telling him a version of the truth she hadn't told anyone since that single counseling session freshman year. She did not tell him everything, not that first conversation, but she told him enough, that something had happened her senior year of high school with someone she'd trusted, that she'd spent 3 years since then keeping every man at careful, deliberate distance, and that she genuinely had not expected, walking into this project, that the distance would be this hard to maintain around someone who kept quietly, consistently proving he wasn't a threat without ever once making a show of proving it. Her voice shook through most of it, and more than once she stopped entirely, certain she'd said too much, only to find Ryder waiting patiently each time, never rushing her, never filling the silence with the kind of reassurance that would have made the moment about his own discomfort rather than her honesty. Ryder listened without interrupting, without offering advice she hadn't asked for, without the kind of performed sympathy that made her feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard, and when she finally finished, he told her simply that he was glad she'd trusted him with even that much, and that he had no intention of ever giving her a reason to regret it. Word of Ryder's unusual attentiveness toward his quiet lab partner spread through the swim team locker room considerably faster than either of them anticipated, and his teammate Deshawn cornered him after practice one afternoon with the particular bluntness only a longtime friend could get away with. "You've been showing up to voluntary lab sessions, man. Voluntary. You hate voluntary anything." Ryder told him it was about the grade, a claim Deshawn met with a laugh loud enough to echo off the locker room tile. "You've had a 4.0 in every science class you've ever taken without trying. This isn't about the grade." "Then what is it about?" Ryder shot back, more defensively than he intended, and Deshawn, toweling off with the easy confidence of a man who'd known Ryder since freshman orientation, just shrugged and told him that he'd figure it out eventually. Everyone always did, usually right around the moment it stopped being convenient to keep pretending otherwise. Ryder didn't have a good answer for that, mostly because he didn't fully have one for himself yet, and he spent the rest of that practice swimming considerably harder than his coach's set actually required, trying to outpace a question he wasn't ready to sit with. The turning point came during finals week, when Clara, exhausted and overwhelmed after an all-nighter finishing their project's final data write-up, found herself walking back to her dorm alone across a poorly lit section of campus and heard footsteps closing distance behind her, a group of unfamiliar men's voices calling out comments she'd spent 3 years training herself to walk faster past without acknowledging. Her hands started shaking before she consciously registered the fear, old, familiar panic rising fast enough that she nearly dropped her laptop bag, her mind flashing without permission back to a parking lot 3 years and 3 states away that she had spent every day since trying not to think about, and it was Ryder, walking back from a late pool session with his gear bag over one shoulder, who spotted her from across the quad and closed the distance in seconds, positioning himself calmly, but unmistakably between Clara and the group without a single raised voice or aggressive gesture, simply informing them with quiet, immovable authority that she was walking with him now, and the group, sizing up exactly who they were dealing with, dispersed without further comment. He didn't ask her what had scared her so badly, didn't press for details she clearly wasn't ready to give, just matched his pace carefully to hers and let the silence between them say what neither of them needed to put into words yet. Clara did not speak again until they reached her dorm building, and when she finally did, her voice was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "You didn't have to do that," Ryder told her, with a directness that had replaced most of his earlier gruffness weeks ago, that he absolutely did have to do that, that watching her spend an entire semester carefully constructing distance around herself because of what other men had cost her had made him considerably more aware than he used to be of exactly what that fear actually looked like walking home alone at night, and that he had no intention of being one more person who saw it happening and did nothing. Clara, standing in the doorway of her dorm with her heart still racing from adrenaline rather than fear this time, found herself doing something she had not done with any man in 3 full years, reaching out and taking his hand, just briefly, just long enough to say thank you in a way words alone couldn't quite manage. Their project earned the highest mark in the class, Professor Hale specifically praising the unusual depth of their fieldwork alongside the data analysis, remarking in front of the entire lab section that she'd rarely seen partners whose individual contributions complemented each other so precisely. A comment that made Clara duck her head to hide a smile she wasn't quite ready to explain to the classmates glancing curiously between the two of them. Neither of them cared nearly as much about the grade by that point as they once expected to, though Ryder kept the printed rubric folded in his gym bag for weeks afterward, telling Clara only that it felt like proof of something considerably more important than a course requirement. Ryder's coach noticed, over the following weeks, a change in his swimmer that had nothing to do with technique, a lightness in Ryder's demeanor between sets that had been entirely absent for 2 years of relentless, isolating focus, and when his coach finally asked him directly whether something had changed, Ryder admitted, somewhat to his own surprise, that he'd apparently found something worth building space for in a life he'd spent years deliberately keeping empty. Clara, for her part, found herself walking across campus with her eyes up for the first time in longer than she could remember, not because the fear had simply vanished, healing rarely worked that cleanly, but because she had finally found one person patient enough to prove that not every man deserved the flinch she'd trained herself to give them all. 6 months after Professor Hale's coral restoration project ended, Ryder qualified for Olympic trials in the 200-meter freestyle, and Clara sat in the stands at his qualifying meet wearing his old team hoodie, cheering loud enough that he heard her voice specifically over the crowd noise the moment he surfaced from his final turn. A detail he told her afterward had shaved actual measurable time off his split, though she suspected he was exaggerating for her benefit. "I still don't know how you got me to talk to you," Clara told him that night, both of them sitting on the edge of the pool deck long after the crowd had cleared out, her feet dangling just above the water, while his gear bag sat forgotten beside them. "I didn't get you to do anything," Ryder said. "I just stopped giving you a reason to keep your distance, and you did the rest yourself, whenever you were finally ready to." "That's a very diplomatic way of saying you wore me down for an entire semester," Clara said, and Ryder, grinning in the particular way that had become considerably more frequent over the past 6 months, admitted that he preferred to think of it as patient persistence rather than wearing anyone down, though he wasn't going to argue too hard about the distinction if it meant she kept showing up to his meets. Clara, looking at a man she once could not bring herself to make eye contact with, found she was finally, genuinely ready, not because the fear was entirely gone, but because she had learned, one careful, unhurried gesture at a time, that not every hand reaching toward her was something to flinch away from. "So tell me, do you think Clara opened up to Ryder too quickly given everything she'd survived, or did he actually earn that trust one quiet gesture at a time?" Let me know what you honestly think in the comments below, and if this story kept you hooked until the very end, make sure to hit subscribe so you catch the next one the moment it goes live, because somewhere out there, another unlikely lab partnership is already turning into something neither person saw coming.